October 2022, Newark, New Jersey. The demolition of a derelict industrial laundry was proceeding on schedule, a routine job of erasing a forgotten structure. Then, the excavator's bucket scraped against metal where engineering blueprints showed only compacted earth. It was a ventilation shaft, a wide, forgotten artery of steel running from the flooded basement to the collapsed roof, sealed at both ends decades ago. Inside, wedged in the vertical darkness, was a human skeleton. But it was the right hand that commanded a stunned silence from the work crew. The bones of the palm and fingers were clenched in a permanent fused grip around a fanned-out deck of playing cards. A perfect royal flush in spades, its unique plastic polymer still gleaming in the sudden, intrusive daylight. At that moment, the case of the disappearance of Michael Reeves, who vanished 24 years prior, was no longer cold. It was wide open. April 1998. The world of Michael Reeves was not one of campus parties or student activism. It was a quiet universe of numbers contained within the ivy-covered walls of Columbia University. At 19, he was a prodigy, a mind that saw the elegant dance of probability in every random event. Socially, he was a ghost, but in the lecture halls of the mathematics department, he was a giant. His dorm room wasn't decorated with posters, but with whiteboards covered in sprawling, complex equations. For months, he had been obsessed with a single concept: perfect card counting. Not the parlor trick of memorizing dealt cards, but a true mathematical model that could predict outcomes by analyzing variables far beyond the deck itself. He believed he had solved it, creating a system that could dismantle the very concept of chance in a game of poker. On his last evening, he explained it to his roommate, not with excitement, but with the calm certainty of a physicist describing gravity. He was going to a game, an exclusive high-stakes game, he said, to test the model. It wasn't about the money, it was a purely academic validation, the final proof of his theorem. The location was vague, an industrial area in Brooklyn, a place where the city's facade gave way to warehouses and shadows. He left his room just after 9 p.m. On his desk, a notebook lay open to a page of dense calculations, the ink still fresh. He wore a simple jacket, took no bag, and carried nothing but his wallet and the quiet, unshakable confidence of his own intellect. The doorman saw him hail a yellow taxi on Broadway, a solitary figure heading out into the New York night to conduct an experiment. The taxi's red taillights disappeared into the flow of city traffic. His roommate fell asleep, expecting to hear him return. The next morning, Michael's bed was untouched. The notebook on his desk remained open to the same page. The phone in their room did not ring. The vibrant, calculating mind of Michael Reeves had simply ceased to broadcast. There was only silence, complete and final. The Newark demolition site was no longer a construction zone. It was an archaeological dig into a single vertical grave. Detective Aaron Delgado of the New Jersey State Police Cold Case Unit arrived to a scene that defied conventional forensics. His crime scene was not a room, but a 70-foot drop of corrugated steel, and his primary witness was a skeleton that had been clinging to a winning hand for 24 years. The extraction was a painstaking, delicate operation, a piece of reverse engineering that took the better part of a day as the forensic team documented every speck of dust, every rust flake, every fragment of cloth that had survived the long years in the dark. The initial report from the medical examiner landed on Delgado's desk 48 hours later. It was a document of cold, hard facts that painted a brutal picture. The victim, identified as Michael Reeves through dental records, had suffered multiple catastrophic fractures to the skull, spine, and ribs, consistent with a fall from a significant height. This was the obvious conclusion, the official cause of death. But a deeper analysis of the porous bone marrow revealed a second, more sinister truth. Traces of phenobarbital, a powerful barbiturate, were present in concentrations high enough to render a man completely unconscious. Michael Reeves was not pushed into the shaft during a struggle. He was sedated. He was inert cargo, dropped into the darkness like a stone down a well. This finding immediately generated the first critical questions of the new investigation. Who had access to this derelict, semi-secluded industrial facility back in 1998? Why go to the extreme effort of transporting an unconscious body here to this specific, forgotten corner of Newark? And most unsettlingly, why sedate a man you intend to kill with a 70-foot fall? It was an act of profound caution, an absolute guarantee of silence and non-resistance. Then there were the cards. The lab confirmed they were not paper. They were a custom-blended polymer resin, a material designed for extreme durability, immune to moisture and decay. This was not a deck one bought in a corner store. It was commissioned, expensive, and unique. The staging of the royal flush was no accident. It was a statement, a signature, a taunt left for an audience that was never supposed to arrive. Putting these initial pieces together, Detective Delgado could already see the outline of the truth. This was not a gambling debt gone wrong. It was not a crime of passion. The meticulous choice of disposal site, the pharmacological precision, the symbolic gesture with the cards, it all pointed to a single, chilling conclusion. This was a meticulously planned execution, carried out by someone with resources, foresight, and an unnerving sense of theatricality. The laundry was not the scene of the crime. It was merely the final, silent resting place, a steel and concrete tomb designed to keep its secret forever. The original 1998 NYPD missing person report was assigned case number 7294. In a city grappling with thousands of violent crimes a year, the disappearance of a 19-year-old university student, last seen willingly getting into a taxi, did not trigger immediate high-level alarm. The investigation, led by a pair of overworked precinct detectives, followed a predictable and ultimately fruitless trajectory. They interviewed his roommate, confirmed his meager bank account was untouched, and noted the absence of any ransom demand. The case file began to fill with statements that all said the same thing. Michael Reeves lived a life so insular and quiet, it was almost impossible for him to have made any enemies. The detectives briefly latched onto the only tangible lead, the high-stakes poker game. They canvassed the usual suspects, shaking down informants and leaning on known operators of illegal gambling dens in Brooklyn and Queens. But the world they were probing was one of back-alley bookies and loan sharks, not theoretical mathematics. The game Michael described, exclusive, intellectual, run by unknown elites, was a phantom. It existed on no one's radar. It was a ghost story, and veteran cops had no time for ghost stories. The theory of a simple gambling debt gone wrong collapsed under a total lack of evidence. With no body and no suspects, the official narrative shifted to the most common explanation for a missing teenager. He was a runaway. His family's desperate pleas, their insistence on Michael's stable, predictable nature, were noted in the reports with a kind of weary, bureaucratic sympathy. To the NYPD, he became just another statistic, a young man who perhaps buckled under the pressure of his own genius and decided to walk away from his life. The investigation slowed from a run to a walk, and finally to a complete standstill. But looking back at the case file now, with the benefit of 24 years of hindsight, a more sinister pattern emerges. The search for the exclusive game didn't just go cold. It hit a wall of impenetrable, well-mannered silence. Inquiries made to certain social clubs and financial circles were met with polite, unassailable ignorance. There is even a cryptic handwritten note in the margin of the lead detective's log, mentioning a discreet inquiry from a powerful law firm representing unnamed civic interests, simply wanting to confirm that no prominent names were being unduly inconvenienced by the investigation. The pressure was never overt. It was a subtle, atmospheric change that communicated one simple message: stop looking here. Within 6 months, case 7294 was effectively inactive. The file, thick with dead ends and unanswered questions, was boxed and sent to the archives. The official story was that Michael Reeves had vanished into thin air. The truth was far more precise. The system hadn't failed. For the perpetrator, it had worked perfectly. The silence that swallowed the case was not accidental. It was architectural, a carefully constructed soundproof room built of influence and denial. It was a form of complicity that ensured the steel shaft in New Jersey could hold its secret in peace, undisturbed for decades. Forensic science could reconstruct a death, but it couldn't reconstruct a life. To understand why Michael Reeves ended up in that shaft, Detective Delgado had to resurrect the world of 1998. His team began the painstaking process of re-interviewing every person connected to the original failed investigation. They were chasing ghosts, hoping one of them could still speak. Michael's former roommate, now a tenured professor of computer science, spoke to them via video call. His memory was a collection of faded, 24-year-old snapshots. Michael's quiet intensity, the endless equations, the almost complete lack of a social footprint. He remembered the final conversation about the poker game, and his voice was heavy with a guilt that time had failed to erode. But he offered no new names, no new locations, just the sad, clear portrait of a brilliant mind walking willingly into an ambush he could not calculate. The lead detective from the original NYPD case was easier to find. He was retired, living in a small condo in Fort Myers, Florida. Over the phone, his voice was thick with the gravel of age and cynicism. He remembered the Reeves case as a thoroughbred head-scratcher, a file full of nothing. He confirmed the dead ends, the phantom poker game, the fruitless search. But then, prompted by Delgado's pointed questions about influential pushback, he paused. He recalled the polite inquiry from the high-powered law firm. He couldn't remember the firm's name, but he remembered the feeling it left him with, the distinct impression he was being warned off a cliff he couldn't even see. While one team chased human memory, another followed the immutable trail of physical evidence. The playing cards, still held in a sterile evidence container, became the focal point. A materials science lab at Quantico returned a detailed report. The polymer was a bespoke composite, a blend of plastics designed for a specific weight, texture, and near indestructibility. It was not a mass-market product. This was a custom order, a one-off commission. The search for the manufacturer began. It led them to a company called Plastex Innovations, which had declared bankruptcy in 2002. Another dead end. But Delgado was relentless. His team tracked down the liquidation company that had handled the bankruptcy auction. They discovered that Plastex's paper archives, decades of invoices, work orders, and client files, had been sold as a single lot to a paper recycling firm and were now sitting in a cavernous warehouse in Paterson, New Jersey, stacked on pallets 20 feet high. For 3 weeks, detectives waded through a sea of decaying paper, the air thick with the smell of dust and forgotten commerce. They scanned thousands of documents, looking for a single order that matched the unique polymer composition. It was a search for a whisper in a hurricane of noise. And then, a junior detective found it. A single invoice, dated November 1997. The thin thermal paper was faded, the ink barely legible. The order was for a prototype set of 52 gaming wafers. The chemical formula listed in the notes was a perfect match. And at the bottom, under the client information, was the buyer, a corporate entity with a Manhattan post office box address listed simply as VM Enterprises. The name was entered into the case file. In a database of millions of registered businesses, it meant nothing. It was just another set of initials, another ghost. For now. The initial investigation into VM Enterprises yielded nothing. It was a shell corporation, a legal ghost with a post office box for a face, dissolved in the year 2000. With that trail cold, Detective Delgado's focus shifted to the only other piece of solid ground he had, the disposal site itself. In the 1990s, the derelict Newark laundry facility was not just abandoned, it was territory. Local law enforcement and FBI files from the era were unequivocal. The property was an unofficial asset of the Falcone crime family, used for storing contraband and conducting discreet business. A grim but logical narrative began to emerge. Michael Reeves, a naive genius, somehow gets an invitation to a high-stakes game, unaware that his hosts are mobsters. He brings his perfect mathematical system to a table where the house always wins, not through chance, but through intimidation. He doesn't just win, he humiliates them. In the world of the Falcone crew, such an insult, especially from an outsider, would have only one possible resolution. The disposal of his body in their own territory would have been an act of brutal convenience. For months, this became the investigation's central theory. Delgado and his team dove deep into the Falcone family's history. They cross-referenced known enforcers with prison records and parole reports from 1998. They put pressure on old informants, squeezing them for 24-year-old memories of a card game and a missing college kid. The theory gained traction when a former associate, now in witness protection, vaguely recalled hearing a story about a math geek from the city who had caused a problem at a game in Jersey around that time. Delgado was convinced he was closing in. The trail led them to a man named Leo Gallo, once a feared Falcone enforcer, now a 78-year-old resident of a state-run nursing home in Atlantic City. He was the only surviving senior member of the crew who was active and not incarcerated in the spring of 1998. Delgado found him in a sunroom, a frail man in a wheelchair, staring blankly at the ocean. He laid out the case, presenting the facts calmly: the body, the location, the timing. He expected denial, or perhaps a weary, late-life confession. Instead, Leo Gallo laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. He looked at Delgado, his eyes suddenly sharp and lucid, and in them was not guilt, but a flicker of an old, familiar fear. "That place?" he said, his voice a low whisper. "We never touched that laundry. Nobody did." He explained that the building wasn't theirs to use. It belonged to someone else, an outside player so wealthy and so connected that the Falcone family was paid a substantial retainer simply to keep its distance and allow the world to believe it was their turf. It was a perfect piece of misdirection. Gallo wouldn't say a name, only that they were a ghost, someone from a different league. The mob theory, so carefully constructed over months of painstaking police work, did not just collapse. It evaporated, leaving Detective Delgado with a far more terrifying reality. The true killer wasn't a gangster, but someone who could rent a crime family to act as a scarecrow for his own private graveyard. The investigation was adrift. The mob theory, a solid anchor for months, had been a deliberate deception, a ghost story told to keep the real monster hidden. Detective Delgado was left with a handful of disconnected facts: a skeleton holding a perfect hand, a set of custom-made polymer cards, and a defunct shell corporation named VM Enterprises. The trail was colder than it had ever been. Then, at 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, an email arrived in Delgado's inbox. It came from an encrypted, untraceable address. There was no subject line. The body contained a single sentence: "He never let anyone leave the table." Attached was one grainy scanned photograph. The image was a window into a secret world. It depicted a card game in a richly furnished room, the men in expensive suits, the air thick with cigar smoke. In the foreground, a man in his early 40s stared across the table, his face a mask of cold, intellectual fury. His opponent was a blurry, indistinct figure, his features lost to the poor quality of the scan. But the cards on the table in front of him were perfectly, chillingly clear. A fanned-out royal flush in spades, the exact hand, the exact cards. It was a photograph of the moment just before Michael Reeves's life was forfeit. Delgado's team ran the face of the furious man through every database they had. The match came back in 0.8 seconds. The name was Victor Mallory, Not just any name, but a titan of the modern world, a reclusive tech billionaire, a celebrated philanthropist, the architect of the predictive data algorithms that powered a global financial empire. And the name of his original holding company, founded in 1997, was VM Enterprises. The initials weren't a ghost, they were a signature. The photograph provided the who. Michael's own work would provide the why. Delgado sent the young man's college notebooks, filled with pages of arcane equations, to a team of cryptographers at the NSA. The initial report was baffling. The math was too complex for a simple card-counting model. Then one analyst saw it. This wasn't a system for predicting cards. It was a system for predicting people. It analyzed betting patterns, involuntary tells, and risk aversion to forecast player behavior with terrifying accuracy. It was a primitive but undeniably brilliant version of the exact same behavioral prediction algorithm that Victor Mallory had patented 5 years later, the very algorithm that had become the cornerstone of his multi-billion-dollar fortune. Michael Reeves hadn't just gone to a poker game to test a theory. He had unknowingly presented a self-proclaimed god of numbers with a perfect, elegant proof that a 19-year-old kid from Colombia had invented his entire kingdom first. The motive was suddenly crystal clear. It was never about money. It was about the theft of genius and the cold, absolute necessity of erasing the original architect. The scattered pieces of the puzzle, the cards, the company, the rage in the photograph, the stolen algorithm, snapped together into one horrifying, complete picture. Based on the full confession of the man known only as the caretaker, corroborated by the forensic evidence and Mallory's own recovered financial records, the final hours of Michael Reeves's life can now be reconstructed with chilling precision. The game was held at the Lyceum, a clandestine salon Mallory operated from the penthouse of a private Wall Street tower. It was an intellectual slaughterhouse where the world's elite came to test their wits and egos. That night, Michael Reeves was the invited lamb. For 5 hours, he played with a quiet, unnerving focus. He wasn't reading the cards, he was reading the table, his mathematical model deconstructing not just the probabilities of the deck, but the very psychologies of the powerful men around him. The final hand was a formality. When Michael laid down his royal flush, he wasn't just winning a pot of money he didn't care about. He was performing a public, intellectual dissection of Victor Mallory, proving that the man who saw himself as a god of numbers was, in fact, entirely predictable. The silence in the room was absolute. Mallory did not erupt in anger. His response was far more terrifying. He smiled. He stood, walked over to Michael, and offered a gesture of congratulations, a glass of single malt scotch from a private decanter. To the 19-year-old, lost in the triumph of his academic proof, it was a sign of respect from a formidable peer. He accepted the drink. It was his last conscious decision. The phenobarbital, tasteless and swift, began its work within minutes. The world for Michael began to soften at the edges. His thoughts, usually so sharp and clear, became a sluggish fog before dissolving into complete blackness. The caretaker was summoned. Michael was no longer a guest. He was cargo. They moved him through a private service elevator to a waiting sedan in the building's secure garage. The journey from the heart of Manhattan to the industrial wasteland of Newark was a silent 40-minute drive across the Hudson. Michael Reeves, the prodigy who had just unlocked a billion-dollar secret, was slumped unconscious in the back seat. At the derelict laundry, the plan was executed with cold, procedural efficiency. The caretaker had scouted the location weeks in advance, selecting the sealed ventilation shaft as the perfect vertical tomb. They dragged Michael's inert form to the edge of the gaping, dark opening on the building's roof. There was no struggle, no final plea, just the quiet lifting of dead weight over the precipice. It was followed seconds later by a single definitive sound from the depths, an impact that marked the final solution to a mathematical problem Victor Mallory could not solve on his own. But the act was not complete. Mallory had brought a second, identical deck of the custom-made polymer cards. The caretaker descended to the basement access hatch of the shaft. In the pitch black, he performed the final symbolic act. He forced Michael's cooling fingers around the royal flush in spades, fusing the hand into a permanent monument to Mallory's stolen victory. This wasn't a burial. It was an act of intellectual plagiarism, a signature written in bone and plastic and then sealed away in the dark, intended to remain silent for eternity. The arrest of Victor Mallory was not a quiet affair conducted in the sterile confines of an interrogation room. It took place at a charity gala in Manhattan, under the glare of television cameras and the gaze of the city's elite. As he stood at a podium, accepting an award for philanthropy, Detective Aaron Delgado and two federal agents stepped into the light. The cold click of handcuffs around the billionaire's wrists echoed through the stunned, cavernous ballroom. The public unmasking of the man who had built an empire on predictive algorithms began that night, not with a confession, but with a look of supreme, undisguised contempt for the forces that had finally caught up to him. The trial was a global media event. The prosecution's case was built on two unshakable pillars: the cold, forensic link of the polymer cards to VM Enterprises, and the chillingly detailed testimony of the caretaker. On the stand, the old man, speaking in a quiet, steady voice, methodically dismantled Mallory's carefully crafted public persona. He recounted the events of that night with the precision of a man who had replayed them in his mind for 24 years. Mallory, for his part, sat at the defense table in impeccable suits, watching the proceedings not with the fear of a man on trial for his life, but with the detached curiosity of a king observing a peasant revolt. He never testified. He never had to. His arrogance was his only statement. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The verdict was guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence, mandatory and absolute, was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The fall of Victor Mallory sent shockwaves through the financial world. The revelation that his foundational algorithm was stolen from the mind of a murdered prodigy triggered dozens of lawsuits and a full-scale corporate implosion. The empire built on a secret was now being publicly dismantled. Michael Reeves's parents, frail and in their late 70s, sat in the front row for every day of the trial. They listened to the grim details of their son's final hours, their faces etched with a grief that time had not diminished, but only sharpened into a quiet resolve. When the verdict was read, they did not weep or embrace. They simply held hands, a silent acknowledgement that the question that had haunted their lives for nearly a quarter of a century had finally been answered. The legal system had provided a conclusion, a name, and a consequence. But justice could not restore the years of silence, nor could it fill the void left by a brilliant mind extinguished too soon. And as for the caretaker, the man who physically carried out the disposal, he walked free. In exchange for his testimony, he was granted full immunity from prosecution. He returned to his quiet life, running a small bookstore in a peaceful Vermont town, a living ghost of the crime. He was legally absolved, but his sentence was of a different kind. To live out his days with the clear, unvarnished memory of what he had done in the dark, a silent witness to a truth that had finally found its voice. The demolition of the Newark Industrial Laundry was never completed. It stands today as it was left when the investigation began, a skeletal ruin surrounded by a chain-link fence, an accidental monument to the secret it was forced to give up. Inside, the ventilation shaft remains a column of silent, empty darkness. Victor Mallory resides in a maximum security penitentiary, a man who built an empire on predicting the future, now confined to a reality of concrete and steel, with a future that is absolute and unchanging. His name has become a cautionary tale in the worlds of finance and technology, a synonym for stolen genius. The evidence that condemned him has taken on a life of its own. In a National Museum of Criminology, behind a pane of reinforced glass, sits a perfect, resin-cast replica of a skeletal hand clutching a royal flush in spades. It is the single most visited exhibit. It serves as a permanent, chilling testament to the fact that some truths are so powerful they can survive being entombed in steel, outlasting the men who tried to bury them. In the end, this was never a story about a poker game. It was a story about an ego so pathologically fragile that it chose murder over the simple admission of being second best. Victor Mallory's complex algorithms could predict markets and human behavior with astonishing accuracy, but they failed to account for one simple, immutable variable: that a fact, no matter how deep you hide it, does not cease to exist. Today, the wind blows through the broken windows of the old laundry. The noise of the trial has long since faded, but the silence that hangs over the property is different now. It no longer conceals a secret. It holds a verdict, a final, unassailable hand that, after 24 years of waiting in the dark, finally got to play its cards.